The glass slipped from my hand and shattered against the floorboards when Rowan, the Alpha King whose scent still haunted my dreams, stepped into my pub and locked eyes with the daughter I'd kept secret for 8 years. His gaze, carrying the weight of the Blackwood crown, swept over the dim room of the elder bark before pinning Willow where she stood near the hearth, holding a bundle of dried lavender. The recognition was instantaneous and terrifying. She had my face, but she possessed his unmistakable presence, the same proud tilt of the head and those glowing violet eyes that marked his direct lineage. 8 years of silence, of hiding in the mist of a border town, and of playing the role of a widowed barmaid dissolved in a single heartbeat. His royal guards fanned out, sealing the exits of the pub. There was no back door left to run through. When Willow tilted her head, watching the armored man with a curiosity that lacked any fear, I stepped between them, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Rowan didn't look at me. His focus was a laser on the girl. He didn't ask. He commanded the air itself, demanding to know how many winters she had seen. When I lied, my voice thin and cracking, claiming she was barely 7, Rowan reached out. With a slow, deliberate movement that brooked no resistance, he brushed her silver-tinted hair aside to check the base of her neck. He didn't need to see the mark to know. The Blackwood flare in her eyes was shouting the truth. The Alpha King had found his daughter, and the disposal I had fled from 8 years ago had finally caught up to us. 8.5 years ago, my life was measured in the scent of crushed herbs and the dirt beneath my fingernails. As a palace gatherer, I was a ghost in the royal gardens, an omega whose only purpose was to ensure the king's tea was steeped with the right botanicals, and the infirmary was stocked with wolfsbane. I was invisible, a shadow moving through the greenery, far too lowly for anyone of importance to notice. My world was the damp earth, the morning dew, and the quiet peace of the greenhouses. The first time Rowan Blackwood walked into my gardens, the very plants seemed to bow, and the air turned electric before I even turned around to see him. The glass in my hand didn't just slip, it seemed to lose its very essence, shattering against the worn floorboards of the elder bark with a sound like a gunshot. I didn't care about the spilled ale or the ruined crystal. My entire world had narrowed to the doorway where the heavy oak frame now groaned under the weight of a man who shouldn't have been able to find us. Rowan Blackwood stood there, his massive silhouette blotting out the afternoon sun. He looked exactly as he did in my nightmares, scarred, regal, and terrifyingly powerful. His scent hit me before he even moved, a heady rush of cedarwood and winter air that bypassed my lungs and went straight to my heart. Behind him, the silhouettes of his royal guard filled the porch, their armor gleaming with the cold promise of the crown. The usual raucous chatter of the pub died instantly. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to crouch lower. As if intimidated by the Alpha King's presence, I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold despite the heat of the ovens. For 8 years, I had built this life out of shadows and silence. I had scrubbed these floors and served these locals until I was Iris the barmaid, not Iris the runaway Omega. "Willow," I whispered, the name a plea, but it was too late. My daughter stepped out from the kitchen, her small arms cradling a bundle of dried lavender. She was the light of my life, the only beautiful thing I had salvaged from the wreckage of the palace. She stopped when she saw the stranger, her head tilting in that curious, fearless way that always reminded me of him. Rowan's gaze shifted. When his amber eyes landed on her, I felt the air leave the room. He froze, his commanding posture cracking just enough to show the shock underneath. Willow didn't shrink away. She stared back with a quiet intensity. Then, the light caught her eyes, a brilliant, glowing violet hue that no commoner could ever claim. It was the Blackwood flare, the unmistakable mark of his bloodline. Time didn't just slow, it stopped. The drip of ale from the counter and the crackle of the logs became the only sounds in the world. Rowan took a single step forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wood like a drumbeat of doom. His gaze was anchored to her face, tracing the silver streaks in her dark hair and the royal curve of her jaw. 8 years, he rasped, his voice a low growl that vibrated in my very bones. He finally looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of predatory triumph and a deep, agonizing betrayal. "You told me the child was gone, Iris. You swore it before you vanished." I stepped out from behind the bar, my legs trembling, and placed myself firmly between the king and the secret I would die to protect. "She is mine, Rowan. She has nothing to do with you." "Liar," he breathed, the word cutting through the air like a blade. "She has my eyes, and God help you, she has my soul." The scent of crushed rosemary and damp earth had always been my sanctuary, a sharp contrast to the suffocating grandeur of the Blackwood Palace. In the royal gardens, I wasn't an omega or a nameless servant. I was the girl who understood the language of the soil. While the court busied itself with politics and bloodlines, I spent my days on my knees in the dirt, tending to the rare botanicals that fueled the kingdom's healers. I thought I was invisible until the night the air in the greenhouse shifted, turning heavy and electric with the scent of pine and impending storm. Rowan had come to the gardens not as a king seeking counsel, but as a man seeking silence. I remember the way the moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair as he watched me work. His presence so massive, it seemed to shrink the glass walls around us. He didn't look at me with the dismissive pity of the nobles. Instead, his gaze was a slow burning fire that made the blood hum in my veins. Our secret began in the shadows of the night blooming jasmine. What started as a shared silence grew into whispered conversations, and then into a hunger that neither of us could name or deny. In the hidden alcoves of the conservatory, far from the prying eyes of his brother Cassian and the royal council, the Alpha King was mine. He was tender in a way the world never saw, his calloused hands moving over my skin with a reverence that made me forget I was just a gatherer of herbs. Those nights were a fever dream of stolen touches and the frantic beating of 2 hearts that didn't care about rank. He would press me back against the stone walls, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against my neck as he promised that things would change, that he would find a way to keep me by his side. I believed him because I wanted to, because when he held me, the rest of the world felt like a distant, fading echo. But even then, the danger was growing. While we were lost in the heat of our fated bond, the shadows of the palace were lengthening. I didn't know that every secret kiss was being tallied, or that the very gardens where I had found love were being watched by eyes that saw my pregnancy not as a miracle, but as a threat to be removed. I was a girl playing with a king's heart, oblivious to the fact that in the Game of Thrones, an Omega's love is the most dangerous herb of all. The scent of crushed rosemary and damp earth had always been my sanctuary, a sharp contrast to the suffocating grandeur of the Blackwood Palace. In the royal gardens, I wasn't an Omega or a nameless servant. I was the girl who understood the language of the soil. While the court busied itself with politics and bloodlines, I spent my days on my knees in the dirt, tending to the rare botanicals that fueled the kingdom's healers. I thought I was invisible until the night the air in the greenhouse shifted, turning heavy and electric with the scent of pine and impending storm. Rowan had come to the gardens not as a king seeking counsel, but as a man seeking silence. I remember the way the moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair as he watched me work. His presence so massive, it seemed to shrink the glass walls around us. He didn't look at me with the dismissive pity of the nobles. Instead, his gaze was a slow burning fire that made the blood hum in my veins. Our secret began in the shadows of the night blooming jasmine. What started as a shared silence grew into whispered conversations, and then into a hunger that neither of us could name or deny. In the hidden alcoves of the conservatory, far from the prying eyes of his brother Cassian and the royal council, the Alpha King was mine. He was tender in a way the world never saw, his calloused hands moving over my skin with a reverence that made me forget I was just a gatherer of herbs. Those nights were a fever dream of stolen touches and the frantic beating of two hearts that didn't care about rank. He would press me back against the stone walls, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against my neck, as he promised that things would change, that he would find a way to keep me by his side. I believed him because I wanted to, because when he held me, the rest of the world felt like a distant, fading echo. But even then, the danger was growing. While we were lost in the heat of our fated bond, the shadows of the palace were lengthening. I didn't know that every secret kiss was being tallied, or that the very gardens where I had found love were being watched by eyes that saw my pregnancy not as a miracle, but as a threat to be removed. I was a girl playing with a king's heart, oblivious to the fact that in the Game of Thrones, an Omega's love is the most dangerous herb of all. The great woods were not a sanctuary. They were a labyrinth of teeth and shadows, and I was a bleeding rabbit running through the dark. I didn't have the strength of a warrior or the speed of a scout, but I had the desperation of a mother. Every snap of a twig behind me sounded like the cocking of a crossbow, and every howl that echoed through the frost-laden canopy felt like a hand tightening around my throat. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with shards of glass. My bare feet sliced by the jagged stones of the riverbeds I waded through to mask my scent. The search parties were relentless. On the third night, the woods came alive with the flickering orange glow of torches and the rhythmic, heavy thud of paws against the earth. Rowan's elite trackers were close. So close, I could smell the metallic tang of their armor and the aggressive pheromones of the hunt. I pressed my back against the hollow of an ancient rotting cedar, my hands clamped over my mouth to stifle my ragged breathing. Through a gap in the roots, I watched as a massive grey wolf, Rowan's lead beta, paused only yards away. He lifted his snout, catching the air, his yellow eyes scanning the brush with lethal intent. I sank deeper into the mud, praying the scent of decay and damp earth would shield the life growing inside me. The Alpha King's power was a tether I could still feel pulling at my soul, a fated bond that screamed for me to surrender, to run into the light and beg for mercy. But the memory of his cold voice in the war room acted like ice in my veins, freezing the impulse. To return was to die. To stay still was to be caught. When the trackers finally moved toward the northern ridge, misled by a decoy of bloodied cloth I'd snagged on a thorn bush miles back, I didn't celebrate. I crawled out of the dirt, my limbs shaking with exhaustion and hunger. The border was still a week away, and the mountains were beginning to choke with the first snows of winter. I looked up at the thin slice of moon visible through the branches, a silver curve that looked far too much like the Blackwood crest. I was a ghost in my own land, hunted by the man who had once called me his heart, pushed deeper into the frozen wilderness where only the strongest survived. I wasn't strong yet. But as I touched my stomach, I knew I would have to become something far more dangerous than a gatherer of herbs to survive the winter. The winter had finally broken, but the storm that raged inside Bram's cellar was far more violent than the spring thaw. I lay on a bed of moth-eaten furs and sacks of grain, the scent of damp stone and old yeast filling my senses as the first real contractions tore through me. Outside, the world had gone eerie and silent. The moon was being swallowed by a shadow, a rare lunar eclipse that stained the sky the color of dried blood. Bram, a retired soldier with a heart too big for his own safety, hovered by the cellar stairs. His weathered face etched with a worry he tried to hide behind a steady hand and a flickering lantern. Each wave of pain felt like a physical attempt to rip the secret from my body. I gripped the edge of a wooden crate, my knuckles white, my breath coming in shallow, desperate hitches. I was terrified that my screams would carry on the wind, a beacon for the trackers who had never truly stopped looking for the disposal that had escaped them. But as the moon vanished entirely and the cellar fell into a bruised purple darkness, the atmosphere changed. The air didn't just grow cold, it began to hum. It was a low, vibrating frequency that made the glass jars on the shelves rattle against one another. When the final, agonizing push forced a cry from my throat, the cellar didn't fill with the wail of a typical infant. Instead, a shockwave of pure, raw energy radiated from the small life entering the world. The lantern flame didn't flicker. It turned a brilliant, searing violet before exploding into a pillar of light that illuminated every cobwebbed corner of the room. Bram fell back against the stairs, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. "Great Mother," he whispered, shielding his face. The child in my arms was warm, her skin glowing with a faint, ethereal luminescence that slowly faded into her pores. She didn't cry. She simply opened her eyes, those unmistakable, hauntingly beautiful violet eyes that held the depth of an ancient sky. In that moment, the Blackwood flare wasn't just a physical trait. It was a declaration. I had given birth to more than just a daughter. I had brought a princess of the bloodline into a world that wanted her dead. As the shadow passed and the moon returned to silver, I held Willow to my chest. Realizing that no mountain was high enough and no pub was remote enough to hide a power that could command the very light in the room. We weren't just fugitives anymore. We were the keepers of the crown's true fire. Bram passed away on a night when the wind didn't howl, but whispered, leaving the world a little quieter and a lot colder. He had been my shield, the man who had traded his retirement peace for the burden of a fugitive's secret. When I buried him beneath the gnarled roots of the great oak behind the cellar, I didn't just lose a mentor. I lost the last buffer between me and the world that had hunted me. He left me the deed to the elder bark, a pouch of silver, and a final raspy piece of advice. Be the landmark, Iris. Hide in plain sight. I took his words to heart. Trading my herb-stained apron for the heavy leather of a publican, the elder bark transformed from a quiet soldier's retreat into the beating heart of the border town. I learned the rhythm of the ale taps and the specific low-frequency hum of a room full of men who worked too hard and drank too much. I became the woman who knew every villager's favorite vintage and every traveler's unspoken sorrow. I was the Widow Iris, a fixture as steady and unremarkable as the stone fireplace. Willow grew up in the corners of that room, a ghost in the periphery who learned to keep her hood low and her eyes averted. She was my shadow, clearing tables and tending the hearth, her royal fire tempered by the mundane chores of a village girl. To the locals, she was just the quiet, silver-haired child of a hard-working mother. We became a staple of the community, the kind of people who were so integrated into the fabric of daily life that no one thought to look closer. I masked her scent with the constant thick aroma of wood smoke, roasted meats, and spilled hops. But as the years turned into a decade, the piece felt increasingly like a fragile glass sculpture. I spent my nights staring at the door, waiting for a shadow that didn't belong, and my days watching the horizon for the glint of royal armor. I had built a life out of bread and brew, convincing myself that the Alpha King would never look for his lost treasure in a place that smelled of common struggle. I had become a master of the mundane, a woman who could smile at a regular, while her heart stood guard at the entrance. I thought I had succeeded. I thought we were forgotten. But as the 8th year came to a close, the air began to taste of pine and winter, the unmistakable, terrifying scent of a predator who had finally picked up a cold trail. The heavy oak door of the back office clicked shut, sealing out the panicked murmurs of the tavern patrons and the clatter of royal armor. In the small, dim room that smelled of ledger ink and dried hops, the space felt dangerously small, with Rowan's massive frame occupying it. He didn't pace. He stood like a statue of granite, his chest heaving as if he had just run the entire distance from the capital. I backed away until the edge of my desk bit into my spine, my hands trembling so violently I had to tuck them into my apron. "Why, Iris?" The word wasn't a roar. It was a broken whisper that carried more weight than any command. "Why did you run?" I searched every square inch of the kingdoms. I nearly tore the world apart looking for a trace of you, only to find you'd been living in the mud and the mist like a common ghost. I ran to stay alive, I spat, the old fear flaring into a defensive anger. I heard you, Rowan. I heard you tell Cassian that the Omega was a liability. I heard you order my disposal so you could marry your northern princess. Do you think I'm a fool? I wasn't going to let you kill our child for the sake of your precious succession. Rowan flinched, as if I had struck him. He moved then, a blur of motion that ended with his hands gripping my shoulders, not with violence, but with a desperate, crushing intensity. Disposal? Iris, look at me. He forced my gaze up to his, where the amber fire was drowned in a sea of raw, agonizing grief. The disposal was for the assassins Cassian had already hired. I was ordering a sweep of the palace gardens to remove the threats against you. I told him I couldn't have your presence, complicating the succession, because I was planning to abdicate the throne to be with you. I was going to name him regent, so we could be free. I froze, the air in my lungs turning to lead. No, you said. I said what I had to, because I knew he was recording my every word for the council, he rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. I spent 8 years thinking you were dead. I thought my brother had succeeded in murdering the only woman I ever loved. I haven't touched another soul, Iris. I've spent every night in those gardens, staring at the dirt where you used to work, wondering how I failed you so completely. The truth crashed over me. Cold and devastating, my lack of trust, my status as a lowly Omega, had made me the perfect architect of my own tragedy. We had both been running, I from a lie, and he from a ghost. But as his tears hit my cheeks, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. While we had been lost in our misunderstandings, the real predator had never stopped watching. The revelation of Rowan's grief was still ringing in my ears when his posture suddenly shifted from heartbroken lover to lethal predator. He didn't just stand, he coiled, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that hadn't been there moments before. He moved to the small window of the back room, peering through the grime at the tavern floor where my life had seemed so secure only an hour ago. Iris, he said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying vibration. Who is the man by the hearth? The one who has been nursing the same pint for 3 hours? That's Silas, I whispered, my heart beginning to sink. He's been a regular since the spring. He helps with the woodpile. Rowan's eyes darkened to a predatory gold. And the girl behind the bar? The one you hired last month? Ilara. She's just a traveler from the south. They aren't travelers, and they aren't woodcutters, Rowan growled, his hand falling to the hilt of the heavy broadsword at his hip. They are Cassian's vipers. I recognized the stance. They haven't been waiting for me to find you. They've been waiting for the order to move. Before I could process the betrayal, the sound of splintering wood erupted from the main room. Rowan didn't hesitate. He burst through the office door, a silver and black blur of fury. The regulars I had served for months didn't look like villagers anymore. Silas had dropped his act, drawing a curved dagger from his boot, while Ilara vaulted over the bar with a grace that was purely martial. The elder bark exploded into chaos. The royal guards clashed with the hidden spies in a flurry of steel and snarls. Tables were overturned, and the scent of spilled ale was quickly replaced by the copper tang of blood. I screamed for Willow, finding her tucked under a heavy oak table, her violet eyes wide with a terror that was beginning to spark with that dangerous royal light. Rowan was a whirlwind of violence, moving with a speed that defied his size. He intercepted Silas just as the spy lunged toward Willow, his blade catching the man's throat in a spray of red. "You dared to touch my blood," he roared, his voice shaking the rafters. It was a cold awakening. My kind neighbors and loyal staff had been a cage, and I had been the one to walk inside. Every smile Silas had given me was a calculation. Every hour Ilara spent helping me was a surveillance report sent back to Cassian. The pub wasn't a sanctuary, it was a nest of vipers, and as the last of the spies fell to the floor, I realized that the forest was no longer deep enough to hide us. The war hadn't stayed at the palace. It had followed us home. The smoke from the skirmish still hung in the air, mixing with the scent of spilled iron and the cold mountain wind that whistled through the shattered front door of the pub. I looked at the bodies of the people I had called neighbors, spies who had watched my daughter grow just to better plan her kidnapping, and felt the foundations of my 8-year lie turn to ash. Rowan stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his sword dripping onto the floorboards I had scrubbed every morning. He reached out a hand to me, his palm open, a silent plea for a trust I had spent nearly a decade killing. "Iris, there is no more time for hiding," he said, his voice ragged with an urgency that terrified me more than the blades of the vipers. "Cassian didn't just send scouts. My riders have spotted his main battalion crossing the Black River. They aren't coming to talk. They are coming to burn this village to the ground to ensure no rival heir survives the night." I looked at Willow, who was huddled in the corner, her small hands clutching the hem of her tunic. Her violet eyes were wide, and for the first time, they weren't just curious, they were luminous with a power she didn't understand, a beacon that Cassian's men would track through the thickest forest. I felt the familiar, frantic urge to run, to grab her and vanish into the tree line once more. My pride screamed at me to refuse him, to stay the independent woman who had survived without a king or a crown. I didn't want to be a liability in a palace. I didn't want to be the Omega who had been removed. But as the distant sound of war horns echoed from the valley below, chilling the marrow of my bones, I realized that my independence had become a death sentence for my daughter. I could keep running until our legs gave out, or I could give her the army she was born to lead. The pub, my sanctuary, was now a target. The life I had built was a paper shield against a storm of steel. "If I go back," I whispered, stepping toward Rowan until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I am not going as a servant. I am not going as a secret." Rowan's fingers closed around mine, his grip a vow. "You are going back as the mother of the future queen. You are going back as my mate. I will burn the world down before I let them touch either of you again." I looked back at the hearth of the elder bark one last time, shedding the skin of the barmaid. I took Willow's hand, feeling the spark of her royal bloodline hum against my palm. I chose the crown, not for the gold or the throne, but for the wall of steel Rowan promised to build around our daughter. The hunt was over. It was time to become the hunters.